Nandana Prachajana Ranjana Yashodanandana Prachajana Ranjana Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Yamuna Tira Vanachari Yamuna Tira Jaya Radha Madhava Punjabi Hari Jaya Radha Punjabi Hari Jaya Radha Madhava Punjabi Hari Jaya Radha Punjabi Hari Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Paramaharaj Acharya Asto Tarasata Sri Srimad Divine Grace Abhay Chaitanya Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. His WPT founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Shri Shri Kodanitai Maya Koshashi Ki Jai. Shri Chaitanya Charitamrita Ki Jai. Nitai So we are reading from the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Uniting Two Worlds, which is volume 6. And the chapter is entitled Preaching to America Part 2. Excuse me, how many already got today? Oh, Hare Krishna. An Indian visitor was explaining to Prabhupada why India had to build up nuclear weapons and armed forces. But Prabhupada disagreed. The reason, he said, was the dearth of genuine Kshatriyas. There were no more men of courage, therefore a woman was now in charge. In the newspapers also had been much coverage of a US merchant ship, the Mayaquez, which, when sailing within the 12-mile limit of Cambodia, had been seized without warning. President Ford had taken a strong stand, sending in the US Marines. 15 Marines had been killed and 50 wounded in recovering the vessel, and the US had bombed Cambodia. It was proper, Prabhupada said, for the US to take a strong stand in defending its citizens abroad. Yes, America should be strong, he asserted, but first of all they should become Krishna conscious. If they were actually a Krishna conscious nation, they should declare, if you touch the hair of one of our men, there will be a fight. Srila Prabhupada spoke strongly, giving the devotees a vision of a powerful America leading the world in Krishna consciousness. And this stirred within them hopes for a pure patriotism, such as in the ancient Vedic culture, when the world had been ruled by God-conscious leaders. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Got to make America great again. Does this go on me or on the microphone?
You.
Oh, okay. Jai Jai Sri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda.
Jai Jai Sri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda.
Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda. Jaya Advaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jaya Advaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jai Jai Sri Chaitanya Jai Nityananda. Jaya Advaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jai Jai Shri Chaitanya, Jai Nityananda.
Jai Shri Chaitanya, Jai Nityananda.
Jai Advaita Chandra, Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Jai Advaita Chandra, Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda.
Okay, so we're reading from the Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Leela, chapter 17. The Lord travels to Brindavan, beginning with text number 52. Godabanga Utkala Dakshina Desha Griya Lokera Nistara Kaila Apane Brahmiya. In this way, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu personally toured Bengal, East Bengal, Orissa, and the southern countries, and he delivered all kinds of people by spreading Krishna consciousness. Mathura Jaibara Chale Asena Jarikanda Bila Praya Loka Tahan Parama Pashanda. When Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came to Jarikanda on his way to Mathura, he found that the people there were almost uncivilized and were devoid of God consciousness. Nama Prema Diya Kaila Sabara Nistara Chaitanyara Guda Lila Bhujite Shakti Kara. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu gave even the Beals an opportunity to chant the holy name and come to the platform of ecstatic love. Thus he delivered all of them. Who has the power to understand the transcendental pastimes of the Lord? So purport by His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. As evidence of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mercy, we are experiencing that the people of Africa are taken to Krishna consciousness, chanting and dancing and taking prasadam like other Vaishnavas. This is all due to the power of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who can understand how his potency is working all over the world. Om Adhyayatmanandasya Ganandhara Shalakaya Chakshur Malitamyena Tasma Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapatam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam. Vandeham Shri Guru Sri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Urupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatam Vatam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Padajan Sahitam Shri Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakam Vatamscha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharane Nirvishesha Sandhavani Paschachari Shutadane Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhudevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So this is it's an interesting. When you read Srila Prabhupada's books, it seems to happen quite a lot in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, maybe in the Bhagavatam as well. That depending on what was happening at the particular point in time that Srila Prabhupada was writing the purports, then he would both, because Prabhupada's purports are very often, they're like, it's been described as like a tapestry of the Acharya's purports. So when Srila Prabhupada was writing his books, if anyone's seen, there's a few videos where you can actually watch Srila Prabhupada writing his books. So he has his dictaphone, and then he has open in front of him the original Sanskrit of the Bhagavatam, and then he carried either one or two books with him that were compilations of commentaries by different acharyas, and Prabhupada used those as the main source of information which he put into his own purports. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, definitely those two, and then there were others as well who he would sort of refer to. So, excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. So it'll suddenly explode out in a second now. What was I saying? It's very distracting when you know that it's coming. Thanks, Guru. Hare Krishna. Krishna Chaitanya. So when we read Srila Prabhupada's purports, it's not just Srila Prabhupada, it is Prabhupada's realization, but also what we're getting in Srila Prabhupada's purports is this brilliant synthesis of the realizations of all the previous acharyas, which is why, as the knowledge comes down through parampara, then each different acharya gives his own unique sort of flavor to that information without changing the knowledge which is originally given by Krishna. Krishna hoite chatur mukha hoy Krishna seva mukha. So Krishna gives the knowledge to Brahma, who gives to Narada, who gives to Madhava, and then on it goes down through to Vyas and then Madhava, and it goes on through the parampara, and nothing is changed. But what happens is that each acharya, as it's passed down through the parampara, they give their own unique flavor and their own unique kind of presentation on that knowledge, and then that's passed down until it reaches the present day. And then Srila Prabhupada has taken all of the knowledge which has been gathered over thousands and thousands of years, and all the realizations which have been revealed over thousands and thousands, millions of years, and then he synthesizes all of that into his purports. So when we read Srila Prabhupada's purports, what we're getting is the conclusion of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of devotees practicing pure Krishna bhakti. And that's what appears in Srila Prabhupada's purports, which is why they have so much potency. They have so much potency because all of the acharyas, the entire Guru Parampara, are present within Srila Prabhupada's purports. But as well as synthesizing all of these realizations of the previous acharyas, he also adds to that his own observations of people practicing Krishna consciousness during the particular point in time that he's spreading Krishna consciousness. So sometimes Prabhupada will make comments, like here he's making comments about Africa, other times he'll mention Europe, sometimes he'll mention America, sometimes he'll mention political events which are taking place at that particular point in time, like in the I think it's either in the introduction to the Srimad Bhagavatam or in one of the early purports in the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada says at the point of writing this, our neighboring friend China is attacking India with a militaristic spirit, and for thousands of years we lived together in peace because at that time there was an atmosphere of God consciousness, but because of a lack of God consciousness, and then he kind of gives a commentary on it, and we're reading that now, like, I mean, wow, 50, 60 years after Prabhupada wrote this, and the events themselves may not really resonate with us, but the realizations and also the examples he gives, although those particular political or social or historical events may no longer resonate with us, but these things are going on generation after generation. There's always war, there's always conflict, there's always politics, there's always issues. So we can draw on Srila Prabhupada's purports and see, well, at that particular point in time, this is what was going on, but that also applies to something which is happening now in our current affairs. And so we can draw on these examples. So although the examples themselves may not be very relevant, like I've given the example before, once I was in Waterstones, not maybe 10 years ago, something like that. I was in Waterstones looking for some book, and there were a couple of girls nearby, like in a nearby aisle, and somehow they must have come across a book about the Beatles, and one of them said to the other, "Oh, they were a famous band, weren't they?" And part of my conditioning, like, it's like, okay, something needs to be said here. We need to re-establish history, but I managed to kind of keep a grip on my false ego. But the point is that even the Beatles, here we are, how long has it been? 40, 50 years, and even that's fading into history. It's like we say now, George Harrison brought back to Vedanta Manor, and at least 50% of the faces will just kind of look back at you with this blank, glazed look, like, Who's that? You know, it doesn't resonate with people nowadays. So the particular occasion or the particular events may not be so relevant, but if we can learn something, if we can get a general grasp of what that was referring to, then we can use the realizations that Srila Prabhupada attaches to those events, to events that are happening in the present day. So the point is not the event themselves, but the point is that when these things happen, Srila Prabhupada attaches to those a particular realization or a particular shastric point or philosophical point that he attaches to a particular current event in order to give it more relevance, so that we can see this is, okay, here is the philosophical point, but how do we apply that to our lives? So then Srila Prabhupada gives examples from whatever's happening at that particular point in time, just to illustrate how that philosophical point, what that has to do with the world in which we're living. So similarly, in terms of spreading the Sankirtan movement around the world, Prabhupada will quite often give examples of things that are happening at the particular point in time that he's writing his purports. And, you know, Prabhupada speaks quite a lot about how, you know, at one point in time, the Vedic culture that we hear about throughout the pages of the Srimad Bhagavatam, at one point in time, that was all over the world. And it's actually something that came up in our Bhakti Life group a couple of weeks ago. In fact, if anyone here is expert in that, they can volunteer themselves for taking part in one of our upcoming Bhakti Life groups, because there's a real interest in knowing something about archaeological evidence to show that at one point in time the Vedic culture existed all around the world. And for instance, in fairly recent history, they've discovered deities of Lord Nrsingadev in Germany and different places around Europe. In the Middle East, there are temples dedicated to different demigods. And then if we study things like ancient Greek or ancient Egyptian culture, we can see that although nowadays it's termed as mythology, if you really study it and if you think carefully about it, then the personalities that they're referring to in their ancient spiritual or religious traditions are actually referring to what we now know as being either the Supreme Personality of Godhead or the demigods. And then these different cultures have these different, are conscious of these different demigods and these different personalities, and they're performing different worship and different pujas, you know. And then also we even see, like for instance in the Bible, if we study the Bible, we can see the Vedic connection is there. So at one point, this Vedic culture, it was all over the world. It was all over the world. And then gradually, as Kali Yuga took hold and made its influence known, then gradually that Vedic culture disappeared into history. And then history became myth, and then myth just disappears and it just becomes stories. But it's there. And so, and even in India, you know, Srila Prabhupada says that in India, this is like the last remnant on earth. Because sometimes people say, well, why, what's the big deal about India? But in previously, the whole world was Bharatpash. The whole world was Bharat. This planet was Bharat. But then gradually, as the Vedic culture deteriorated, then the last place on earth where this civilization existed sort of became India. And then now even India, you know, the Vedic, you know, whatever exists, whatever is left of that Vedic culture is very hard to find. You know, it's like I was listening to an interview the other day, and it was said that if you go to Mumbai or if you go to Delhi, you close your eyes, you may as well be in America. You know, it's the same billboards, the same fashion, the same music. You know, it's practically American. You know, so much of that civilization has been lost. And even like if anyone's heard Janavi Harrison's song "Like a River," she sings about going back to Brindavan for the first time after many, many years, and she's saying, you know, cell phones ring instead of bells, Sacred Hill has almost disappeared, you know, hotels rising. So even in Brindavan, I mean, I'm quite a young devotee, so to speak. But even the first time I went to Brindavan was 1998, and then we went back again last year. We went back in 2019, and it just completely transformed. It was just hotels and buildings, so even in the short time that I've been here, I've seen Vrindavan change so much. And then you speak to devotees that have been there since Srila Prabhupada took them on Parikram, and they were saying like they can remember a time when the whole of Vrindavan Parikram was this wonderful soft bed of sand right the way around Vrindavan. Maybe it was like that when you first went, Prabhupada. Yeah, so it's changed so much in just a short space of time. So whatever remnant there is of that Vedic culture or spiritual culture, even in India, is disappearing more and more and more. But still India is kind of, there's still some remnant of it there. And especially when Srila Prabhupada was living in India and when he was living in Vrindavan in the early 1960s, then there was still a lot of that culture, a lot of that original spiritual culture was there. And and so when Srila Prabhupada traveled, first of all, to America, he even wrote in his Makine Bhagavat Dharma poem, I don't know how I'm going to be, that this whole place is saturated with the modes of passion and ignorance. I don't know how I'm going to be able to convince them of your message. If you want me to dance, then make me dance, but I don't know what I can do. I don't know what I can say. And Prabhupada was shocked when he got there and found that he could buy vegetables, because in his mind, he was convinced that, this part of the world was so spiritually degraded that the only thing that would be available to eat was meat. So he said, if needs be, I'll just live off potatoes. And he was surprised when he found he could actually, but even then, Prabhupada spent the first year in America alone, like we see, what is the chapter in the Chaitanya, struggling alone in the wilderness or something. And it's like he spent an entire year practically on his own, just a tiny handful of people that were giving him a little support, but weren't so interested in what he was doing. But years later, he actually revealed that during that time, he was just wandering around the streets of New York City, sitting in parks, traveling in the subway, just watching the culture, trying to get an idea of the actual culture and the mood and the consciousness of the people that he would be speaking to. And there's a funny story actually where Prabhupada went into one grocer's store in America, and he took his, it was probably one of the very first times he ever went shopping in New York City, and he took his food to the checkout, and the woman put it all through the cash register and said, okay, it will cost, going back a few years, so it's probably like, $4. And Prabhupada said, I'll give you $2.50. started haggling. And he said that she was so charmed that she actually said, okay, I'll pay the extra. So she was so charmed by Prabhupada's kind of innocence and naivety, not in the sense that Prabhupada was a naive person, but that kind of the innocent naivety that Prabhupada actually did sometimes display, because Prabhupada had this spiritual innocence, this transcendental innocence in dealing with the world. He even, at one point, it was suggested that one of his grihasta couples could adopt him as their child so they could stay in America. So he had this wonderful transcendental spiritual innocence about him. But he was just watching the world. He was just watching New York, watching the consciousness of the people. And then little by little, he came up with a kind of plan as to how he would share the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu with these people. And that plan was basically, which is the philosophy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, chanting, dancing, and feasting. And he realized more than ever, once he was actually there and he could see with his own eyes that nothing else was going to work. So it's just chanting, dancing, and feasting. And that's what he gave to the people. And from that, everything came. And Srila Prabhupada even said to Hari Sori, one time they went to one festival that had been arranged. And he was always asked to give a talk, give a lecture at the festivals. But Prabhupada said, out of thousands of people that are here in this audience, there may be a small handful that are sort of receptive to hearing the lecture. But he said, our presentation, our preaching is dancing, chanting, and prasadam. And then once that chanting, dancing, and chanting, dancing, and prasadam, once that takes a hold within the consciousness, then people's consciousness will be ready that they can actually hear the philosophy, they can read the books, they can hear the knowledge. But the main presentation is chanting, Harinam, Prasadam distribution. This is the main thing, which is actually why Srila Prabhupada said that ideally, although it may not always be practically possible, but ideally, then at least Harinam should be there to accompany book distribution, so that the people hear the holy name, it purifies the heart, and then they get the book, and then the consciousness has been sort of somewhat prepared for actually reading the knowledge that's in the book. So, but Prabhupada would kind of reiterate this everywhere he went in the world. Like, for instance, here in the purport, he's mentioning Africa. In other places, he mentions Europe. Other times, he mentions America. But he says that by the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, then this movement is spreading all around the world. Because whether we like to hear it or whether we don't like to hear it, the fact of the matter is that 99% of the world, at least in terms of the original pure Vedic culture that once existed, most of us come from backgrounds of what is known in Sanskrit as Mlecchas and Yavanas. And Prabhupada would always say, it's like Hari Sori loves telling these stories. Hari Sori would be taking prasadam, and Prabhupada would come in, and they would all pay their obeisances and sit up and then carry on eating. And it's quite an innocent, simple thing. You pay your obeisances and then you carry on eating. And Prabhupada would say, you're all just Mlecchas and Yavanas. Go wash your hands, purify your hands. It's like, so Prabhupada was so clean, so pure. And, he even uses this expression, revolutionary cleanliness. Because and Hari Sori, he would say to Prabhupada, I'm so sorry, it's just not naturally possible for me to have the standard of cleanliness. And Prabhupada would laugh. He would say, it's okay, you just do the best you can. But Prabhupada's standard of cleanliness and the sort of the actual real Brahminical standard of cleanliness, because many of us may have Brahman initiation. That doesn't necessarily make us Brahmins in the purest sense. Someone who actually has a real Brahminical standard of cleanliness, it's a very, very high thing. And it's like, I've heard other devotees give the example, but I can even give the example from my own life. I think before taking to Krishna Consciousness, I probably used to have a bath maybe once or twice a week. And I remember sometimes days would go by when I wouldn't even clean my teeth. It was just like a really disgusting state of consciousness that I was in at that time. And it never even crossed my mind that there was anything wrong with that. And then, and to kind of come into that kind of environment where, like for instance, the regulative principles that monks and quite serious practitioners of bhakti take a vow to follow at the time that they accept, at the time that they formalize their relationship with their guru. We take these vows that we will never eat meat, fish, or eggs, we will never gamble, we will never have illicit sexual relationships, and we will never take any kind of intoxication ever again. And really speaking, much of the society in which we live, much of the host society in which we live, we could say, especially in the Western world, but it's pretty much pervading the whole world now, is pretty much based on breaking these four regulative principles. When we look at you go into the cities and you see the billboards, or you see the things that are popping up as adverts on your social media feed or something like that. So much of it is based on breaking the regulative principles. It's like they say, sex sells. It's like, as few clothes as possible is generally used as a way to sell practically anything. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with sex, but still, that imagery is used to sell cars and clothes and toothbrushes and everything in the world. This kind of imagery is used to sell that. And the meat industry is just enormous. It's just unbelievable. The amount of animals that are being killed every single day. you know, runs into the billions practically, or at least every year. And then, you know, intoxication, you know, before taking to bhakti or some spiritual path, we wouldn't have thought twice about, you know, starting the day with a cup of coffee and finishing the day with a drink to kind of calm us down at the end of the day, you know. So all of these principles, you know, the world is pretty much built upon the foundation of these principles. And so introducing a very, very high Brahminical culture within that is a real challenge. So, you know, Srila Prabhupada said over and over again, you know, just chanting, dancing and feasting, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what kind of bad habits people have. It doesn't matter how low the consciousness is. You know, we don't judge people by their bad habits. What we have to offer them is just this gift of chanting Hare Krishna, dancing, singing, and eating Krishna Prasadam. And then from that, everything will come in due course of time. And sure enough, everywhere that Prabhupada went in the world, wherever it was, like he gives the example of Africa, and it's interesting because when Srila Prabhupada first sent some of his disciples to Africa, they weren't really sure, because the African culture is very, very different from American culture. And so the American people who went there were just not quite sure how to communicate and how to interact and how to present Krishna consciousness to that particular culture. And so what they did was they approached the Indian communities in Africa and tried to share Krishna consciousness with them, because there are settlements of Indian communities in Africa. And Prabhupada, when he found out, he said, no, we want to share it with the Africans, we want to share it with the Europeans, we want to share it with the Americans, we want to share it with the British. We're not just trying to share it with, you know, just go to wherever Indian immigrants have gone around the world. Obviously, we want to share with them as well, but we want to share with absolutely everyone. And so when Prabhupada went, he looked at the situation. He said, well, in Africa, the culture is all about dancing and chanting. You look at the African tribes and the African villages at that time. You know, obviously, Africa is probably a much more developed continent now. It shows my education. It was only like maybe 15 years ago that I realized Africa was a continent and not a country. So, but you know, when Prabhupada saw, he said, well, this is what their culture is based on. It's based on chanting and dancing. You know, it's a really wonderful, glorious, colorful culture. So Prabhupada said, just give them what they've already got, but add Krishna to it. So you know, devotees were dancing and chanting in the streets of these African towns and villages, and they just took to it like a duck to water, so to speak. It was just, you know, it was the most natural thing in the world. And that's really what Krishna consciousness is. We see what the different cultures are that exist around the world, and then we add Krishna to that culture. People like music, add Krishna to that music. People like dancing, add Krishna to that dancing. You know, and then from that, everything spiritual by nature. So being spirit. so once we add Krishna to whatever we're doing in our life, then that purifying agent enters into the heart and removes anything inauspicious which is there in our lives. So, you know, in our presenting Krishna consciousness to others, the emphasis shouldn't be on what we have to give up. The emphasis should be on what we adopt, what we accept. And then by accepting Krishna, then the negative things that are there in our lives, you know, intoxication, meat eating, gambling, illicit sex, whatever else is there in our life, these things naturally fall away as we get a taste of Krishna consciousness. Pardon, priest Vandavartate, that you know, we gain a higher taste. And naturally, as we gain that higher taste, then the things in our lives which are not so auspicious and which are not so favorable for the cultivation of spiritual life, they will naturally fall away in due course of time. Or at least our consciousness will evolve to the point where we're more receptive to hearing, that will, you know, it's best, you know, if we're able to sort of let go of these things, then that will create an even more favorable atmosphere and more favorable consciousness for practicing Krishna consciousness. So Prabhupada would give examples throughout his books. Here he's using Africa as an example, but in other places he uses different parts of the world. And the principle is pretty much always the same, that the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is not limited. It's not, nothing can stop that mercy. No culture, no society, no material situation can prevent the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu from acting. Nothing can prevent the method of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu from acting on the consciousness of the souls. You know, if we just apply, if we add that method to that host society, then everything will work. And now we see wherever we go in the world, you know, anywhere that we go in the world, people are dancing, they're chanting, and not only that, but you know, as that dancing and chanting and taking of Krishna Prasadam goes on, then they, you know, also, you know, around the world now we see so many amazing scholars and brahmanas and teachers and leaders that have risen up through those host societies and are now, you know, becoming responsible for sharing Krishna consciousness with people all around the world. So this chanting, dancing and feasting, this is the magic formula. It's the magic formula for purifying anything, anything in the world. So we'll stop there if there's any questions, comments, corrections, any points for discussion or reflections. Or if there's anything online also, if anyone wants to make any comments or questions or anything online. Was that?
Yeah, it was just, I was watching Prabhupada Memories just the other day, and Antaluth was saying that Srila Prabhupada, if you're convinced about chanting Hare Krishna, then you don't need to read my books. And of course, being convinced about chanting Hare Krishna means that you're chanting Hare Krishna purely. And so for that reason, most of us will need to read the books, you know, but that's the goal. You have to get to the point where you have full faith and you're chanting purely, because if you're chanting purely, then Vijivadu Jivana, then all the life and the wife of all transcendental knowledge is yours, so you have access to everything.
Yeah. Who was also listening to today? It was an interview with Hanumat Prakash, Prakash or Prashak Swami, Hanumat Prashak Swami, a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, and he was sort of saying also there that at least in a sort of traditional Vaishnav society, you would have a certain element within that society who has as part of their service is to read and study the Shastra and then share that with others. But for most people, hearing that knowledge from those teachers is the general sort of method of receiving knowledge. So you'll always have, there will always be, and also obviously Prabhupada really encourage, you know, to read or hear or study somehow or other, absorb his books. But you know, even if we don't have the sort of nature to really, you know, be particularly academic, or if we're not big readers, by hearing those books and by hearing that knowledge and having it explained, then that can also have the same effect, you know. And then, like you say, you know, the ultimate goal of hearing this knowledge or reading this knowledge or accepting this knowledge is so that we actually put bhakti into practice and, you know, meditate on Krishna while we're doing our service, or meditate on Krishna while we're chanting our rounds. You were going to say something else?
A point came up when we were in Mayapur when Lord was giving class, and he was saying the Brahmins have taken birth in Silicon Valley, and the Malechas have been left to spread Krishna consciousness in the West, you know. But then I was wondering if someone is attracted to the principles of devotional life, then although he may superficially be a Malecha or a Yagna, the fact that he has that enthusiasm to want to practice spiritual life surely qualifies him more than somebody that's born in a situation where culturally he's trained, but then ultimately his attraction is just to go over and make money and gratify his senses.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, even you know, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that anyone can accept this knowledge, and the thing is that we use the, I mean, Varnashram is an important thing. It is an important principle, and it is a fact that every one of us has got a particular nature which, technically speaking, falls into one of those four categories. We're going to be drawn towards either a Brahminical, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra activity. That doesn't necessarily make us Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. Because we're drawn to that particular type of work doesn't necessarily qualify us as purely being in one of those categories. But this is the point, is that, Chaitanya, we have to do work, we have to act, and ideally, if we can act in a way which is most suited to our particular nature, then you'll get the best out of us as individuals, because we're more suited to particular types of work. But, practicing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy and sharing Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy is not based upon being in one of these particular varnas, let's face it, I mean, I can't speak for anyone here, but I can definitely speak for myself. We say in our humility, oh Prabhu, I'm just lower than a Malacha. I was way beyond being lower than a Malacha before I kind of, it's not humility talking. It's like, I was just disgusting before I started trying to, make some effort to be a devotee, but still somehow or other Prabhupada's able to engage even that in sharing Krishna consciousness with others. We can chant the Hare Krishna mantra, we can give out Prabhupada's books, we can give out prasadam, and by sharing Krishna consciousness, I actually heard a really nice thing the other day. It was, again, it was the same, I always forget everybody's Prakash, but anyway, but he was quoting Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who was quoting Srila Prabhupada. And Prabhupada apparently told Tamal Krishna Maharaj that if you read my books with the mood of teaching those, like for instance, if you're going to give a class, and so you read the purport and you sort of study the purport with the mood of what am I going to say in my class, he said you'll get as much out of 15 minutes of reading that normally you would get out of 2 hours of reading. Because when you're actually reading with the conscious mood that, okay, how can I explain this to other people? How can I share that with other people? Then you actually see things that are in the purport, and you connect what's in the purport to other parts of Prabhupada's books that you wouldn't necessarily get if you weren't. So sharing Krishna consciousness means that we ourselves get so much more Krishna consciousness.
Technically, when devotees either in a situation where they have to regularly share their Krishna consciousness through classes or courses, whatever, then they're always on the lookout for something. And also particularly remember when you're on Sankirtan, when you're on the street distributing books, and you meet so many people who have got so many opposing arguments, and even though what you're presenting is a high, you might not be equipped enough to give them the answers then and there. So when sometimes you may temporarily get defeated in argument when you meet someone, but when you go back to reading, you're always thinking, okay, where can I get some ammo for this? And you start taking notes.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're just kind of reading semi-unconsciously, then you get some purification, just like you might get somewhat wet by standing on the shore of the ocean, but then you get more wet sooner and effects will walk into it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of purposeful, you're reading with a purpose, you're trying to find, you're searching already.
Yeah.
It's not casual reading.
Yeah, purposeful reading, yeah.
Also find that if somehow or another your duties at times limit your time for reading, then when you get to read, you're like someone who's really thirsty. Every drop of water is really appreciated. It counts.
Yeah. And it even came up last night. We were doing the Gita Life course last night, and the point came up that for one who is sort of on that path of spiritual realization or spiritual cultivation, then they see spiritual things within even mundane things. Like, for instance, one of the people there was talking about, you know, how she'd watched some movie and it really inspired her on her, you know, and she was saying, does that mean that, you know, these things exist within these things? And the answer that we gave was that it's, you know, for most people, they would probably watch that movie and just see it as a fun action Hollywood movie. But if we're already a little tuned in to spiritual things, then we can find wisdom within even places where there is none. So, you know, we can be looking at the news, and it's like, oh, you know, here is what, like, a kind of similar thing. It's like, you know, you're reading the news, you're seeing the way that leaders are maybe behaving around the world, and it's like, oh, Prabhupada says that, you know, this is how a proper leader should behave. So now we, you know, and you start seeing the world through the eyes of Shastra. You see the news, you see the media, you see pop culture, you see everything through those eyes of, you know, you sort of find Krishna within everything, because Krishna is in everything. That's the point in the 10th canto of the Bhagavad Gita, is that we can see Krishna everywhere.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if I just see Shastra Chapter, you see through the eyes of Scripture, then you can see that even those very intelligent leaders, they're missing the main point, which is a lot of the problems, is the false sense of proprietorship, creating borders, and therefore they have to have security forces and so much elaborate arrangements simply because they're cultivating the type of lifestyle which fortifies the bodily conception.
Yeah.
Whereas if they would cultivate, if everyone's got on board and realised, okay, borders are man-made, and we're only armies there because we're afraid of each other, and we can break these barriers down by inaugurating a spiritual program. Of course, it didn't happen overnight. But, so yeah, even you see mundane things, when you see through the Shastra, it's not that we just go and watch a movie every night and see, let's see what Shastra's got to say about this one.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's like, I mean, that kind of brings us back to this example in the Bhagavatam where Prabhupada says, you know, previously China and India lived together in peace because there was this atmosphere of God consciousness. We saw, you could probably find it on YouTube, but we watched this video with my kids, and it was a world map, and it was showing the map of the world over the last maybe 500 years. And as the years, you know, at the bottom of the screen, it's got like a counter that's showing the years kind of progressing, and then the map of the world's changing colors, and the borders are shifting, the lines are changing. Because you saw it over the years. At this point, this was Germany, and then at this point, this was India, you know, and at this point, Russia extended to here, and then it went to there, and then it went back to there, and you know, and countries are growing and shrinking. So what we call America, what we call Europe, what we call Germany or England or this and that, is just a name given to a particular wall, basically, that's drawn around a certain area of land that's constantly changing. It's either growing or it's shrinking. You know, in time, you know, probably Great Britain will look a lot different in the next few years, possibly. You know? So, yeah, I'm proud of it.
Another point that Roche discussing is devotees who refused entry into one temple in India, and back to Prabhupada, and they say to Prabhupada that they say they'll come back, maybe if you're lucky in your next birth you can enter into this temple. And Prabhupada says, if they're lucky in their next birth they can join this one.
Yeah.
No, it's just reflecting on the whole dynamic of reading itself, because we tend to transfer kind of a mundane experience of things into Krishna consciousness. So eating becomes respecting, and reading becomes dialogue. So you could read the same purport, but every day will speak something different to you, because what's really going on is a holy communion between you and the Lord, and He will use the particular words in a way which, you know, the day before that word didn't seem so significant, but now when you read it, it does, you know. And then you'll read some other book, and again you'll resonate again with a particular point which is pertaining at that time to something that Krishna wants to communicate through to you, you know, and He can't do it directly. or through your chanting right now because it's not pure enough. But if you just allow yourself to access that dialogue, then Krishna will speak to you, and he'll make a particular point which is relevant, and it's not really reading, it's more like conversation with Krishna.
Yeah. I heard a couple of really nice things lately. One of them was an interview with Bhakti Rasayana Sagar Swami Maharaj, who was here when Uttama Sloka Prabhu. He does these sort of Bhagavad Gita based. He was actually inspired to do it by Mahatma Prabhu. It was Mahatma that gave him the idea to do it. And so he deals with professionals, like CEOs and these kind of people. And he does like a sort of Bhagavad Gita based personal development course that's been really, really successful. He also does like leadership training based on Bhagavad Gita. And one of the things that he gets the people to do as part of the course is he says, okay, everyone think of a problem that you have in life. He says, now think of a number between 50 and 800. Now turn to that page in the Bhagavad Gita and keep reading until you find the answer to your problem. And he said every single one of them finds exactly the answer to the problem that they have on that particular random page of the Bhagavad Gita, because they're looking for the answer. So it's kind of the same thing. It's like we can read the books, but unless we're really searching. I heard another interview with Jadharani, Prabhupada's disciple, the artist, and she was saying that she's at a point in her life now where before, it's a similar thing to what you're saying, she doesn't read for the sake of reading anymore. She now reads for the sake of actually hearing from the acharyas. And every time she opens one of Srila Prabhupada's books, she first begins by praying to each separate individual acharya who's contained within the pages of Prabhupada's books and begs them, whatever it is that you're trying to tell me, please let me hear it. Please let me somehow hear what it is that you're trying to tell me. And she's found that it's really transformed her reading. So it's like you're saying, it's like we can read and we should read. We should read just for the sake of reading. It's like Prabhupada was saying, you've got incidental reading and you've got purposeful reading. Shiva Ramaswamy spoke about this in Shuddha Bhakti Chaitanya. He says that both have to be there. Incidental reading needs to be there as part of our sadhana, so that even if we're not quite in the right frame of mind to really go deep into the books, at least we should do some reading, But purposeful reading is much, much, much more powerful when we're actually in that state of mind where we're trying to hear what is it that Krishna's trying to say, what is it that the acharyas are trying to say.
I saw the notice that Prabhupada was considered the enemy classes reading.
Yeah.
You say the hearing is reading.
Yeah. And I think actually that was one of the points that Hanumat Prakash Swami Maharaj.
Hanumat Prishak.
Hanumat Prishak Maharaj. He was saying that Prabhupada tends to emphasize hearing over reading in his purports. If you do a count, then the emphasis tends to be more on hearing, more on actually listening. Was it one devotee was saying, who was it that was here who does the Chant Now website? He was here a couple of years ago. What's his name? Pancharatna. He was saying that one of the first temples he went to, the reading program was that every day they had 1 hour's Bhagavatam class, 1 hour's Nectar Devotion class, 1 hour's Krishna book reading, 1 hour's Bhagavad Gita class. He said there was something like 5 hours of classes a day, and that was basically when most of their study of Prabhupada's books was, that they would read together and discuss and go through Prabhupada's books in that way. So, but he said the emphasis was more on sort of hearing and discussing rather than reading.
It was interesting the other day, a few weeks ago, actually, time seems to have merged into a kind of grey, nebulous form. A while ago anyway, I was down counting the Bhagavad Gitas in the warehouse, and I just reflected on each of those pages Krishna was speaking, and he was speaking originally to Arjuna on the battlefield, knowing that they would end up on pages in the warehouse, and that's where he go, every book with someone's name on, ready to go out. It was amazing to think, that we're part of something which is an amazing, phenomena that's taking place actually.
Because the whole Mahabharata took place so that Krishna could speak the Bhagavad Gita. So that we could, decades and decades of conflict and romance and adventure and war and all these things, it all happened so that ultimately Krishna could stand there and speak the Bhagavad Gita, so that we could get the Bhagavad Gita. Gauranga Prabhu, he had a really nice realization the other day. He was saying he was reading the Bhagavad Gita and he got to this point where Krishna says, I am the gambling of cheats. And he said he realized by hearing that the gambling that took place that led to the war of Kurukshetra, Krishna inspired that gambling, because it was out of character for Yudhisthira. It was very much out of character for him to behave that way, but he became kind of almost possessed to continue with the gambling performance. So when Gauranga read it, it's like, oh, Krishna is the gambling of cheats. It's like Krishna inspired the gambling so that would lead to the war, so that he could then speak the Bhagavad Gita. Same way like the Bhagavatam, Parikshit Maharaj takes a dead snake and wraps it around the sage's head. Parikshit Maharaj is a Rajarishi, is a saintly king, completely out of character, but Krishna inspired him to act in that way so that the Bhagavatam could be spoken. So it's interesting. We should, sorry, Prana, you're in charge. I was going to say we should stop there.
Yeah, I was just thinking that we also have to be careful not to translate that into our own mistakes. Because sometimes people do workers and mistakes, say, it must be Krishna's arrangement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to. I've seen a few things done out of the character which had far-reaching detrimental effects, and I wouldn't necessarily say it was Krishna's arrangement.
Yeah.
Of course, not really brass moves with the Krishna consent, but it isn't to say that if someone does work and mistake, it must be Krishna's arrangement, carry on.
Yeah. Quite often we can see it in hindsight, and I think it's something that it's that we can see in our own lives. Like, for instance, when we look back at the journey that brought us to Krishna consciousness, the things that maybe got us onto the path were not necessarily very good situations that we were going through in life. And at that particular time, if we could, we would have probably done anything to sort of change the situation. But then decades later, when we look back on our lives and we look that by being in this state or going through these things that brought me to Krishna consciousness, then we see it as a blessing. We look back and we can see that it was actually a blessing that I went through these horrors in life, so that eventually brought me to this point of surrendering to Krishna. And then maybe we can see that, well, Krishna maybe had some hand in that. If we are picking up, which, many devotees say the fact that we're here now doing what we're doing means that we're picking up from the journey that we began in a previous life. So Krishna had to do something to get us to the point of picking up where we were, where we left off last time. So although the things we went through were maybe horrible experiences, but we can look back and see them as a blessing because they brought us to this point where we are now. But then, like you say, we also have to learn and not go back to those things again.
I will say also that anything good which happens, credit Krishna, and anything bad which happens, then that's our foolishness.
Yeah.
That's what you see, that's the devotee's attitude.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking with the pandemic as it is right now, it's creating a huge vacuum because people have been distracted by daily routine, and now what's staring them in the face is they don't really know why they exist. And that hunger which has not been addressed is staring them in the face now. And so I think when we do get a chance to go back out and start handing out the books, I think the field will be very right, and people will be more interested to look at see the relevance actually as to why we should be trying to understand what the meaning of our lives are.
Yeah, and not only that, but even devotees, those of us who are practicing Krishna consciousness both here and outside of a sort of temple community, there seems to be a growing sense of, okay, did we fully take advantage of what we had when we had it? Were we really taking advantage of the opportunities that we had to practice Krishna consciousness? You know, so even for devotees, I think there's this sense of, okay, wow, I can actually go out and distribute books, whereas previously it would have been like, oh God, not another day on the street. But then it's like, I can't wait to go out and do Harinam. I can't wait to go out and give someone prasadam, or I can't wait to go to the temple. I've not been to the temple for such a long time. Previously it's like, you go every week, it's like, okay, it becomes like a routine. But when you're not able to do that, then, you know, you realize I had something, and I didn't realize just how good an opportunity that was that I had. So we can all learn, we can all kind of learn from it, and hopefully be, you know, improve ourselves for it, improve our situation for it. We should stop. Okay. Shri Chaitanya Charitamrita ki jai.